Yo, what's up, Serpa Squad? Tanner here, and I'm back with something a little different. I've had this Cloche container sitting around for about a year, and I decided that now was finally the time to do something with it. Let's get started. This container is 9 inches across and 13 inches tall. After making a few calculations, I estimate that it holds roughly 3.5 gallons. I think this is a really good footprint to work with, but there is a slight issue. The base of the container is made of wood. If we were to make a setup with this as is, it wouldn't last long. No worries, I'll just seal the inside of the base with pond shield epoxy. Before doing that, I put tape along the outside to make cleanup easier later on. I mixed up the 2-part epoxy and got to painting. I applied an even coat with a brush and let it cure for a few hours. As expected, one layer wasn't enough. I mixed up a second batch and repeated the process. I let everything cure for a few hours and then removed the tape. After that, everything was left to cure for 24 hours. Unfortunately, some of the epoxy seeped under the tape during application. Not a big deal though. I simply went around with sandpaper to remove all of the excess epoxy. After all of that, I ended up with a clean base. It now has a waterproof coating on the inside to make it suitable for an awesome terrarium. To scape this setup, I'm going to primarily use dragonstone. This is a unique clay-based stone with a ton of nooks and crannies. As you'd expect, these areas will be great for plants. I inspected the pieces to find a way to fit them together. This smaller piece fit perfectly onto a larger one. To keep them together, I'll use Cyanoacrylate Superglue. I put down a glob of superglue and applied pressure. Once the glue was dry, I got a larger piece that fit perfectly into the others. I used a rubber band to hold everything together. Like before, I applied a few dabs of superglue to keep the pieces secure. I let everything dry for about 10 minutes and removed the rubber band. The superglue left behind white residue that I don't want on the hardscape. To hide it, I applied more glue and covered it with dust from the stones. The end result is something that looks totally seamless and like a single piece of stone. I gave the structure a quick spray to clear away any excess dust and debris. I planned for the stones to fit perfectly in the middle of the enclosure, and they do. To attach it to the base, I used Great Stuff Pond and Stone Expanding Foam. I simply left the stone where it was and applied foam in the gaps under the stone structure. I let it cure for a few hours and peeled away excess foam. With the stone secured, I taped off the interior portion of the base. This will be used as a barrier for the expanding foam. I applied the foam along the inside of the tape and let it cure for a few hours. After that time, the tape was removed. I carved down the outside of the foam with a razor scraper to create a substrate layer. I did this in a way that the foam tapers down toward the outsides of the container. Here's a closer look. After carving, I taped off the container for a third and final time. I used the superglue from earlier and Fluval Stratum to conceal the foam. I broke the soil up into dust for better adhesion. Like the stone debris from earlier, I apply the glue, cover it with the soil, and brush away any excess. Once the foam was concealed, I turned the structure upside down to remove debris. The tape was removed, and I ended up with this. The edgework I just created with foam will act as a barrier for water, substrate, and other materials that will be held in the container. There's one more detail I want to add to the hardscape, dragon root. This can be divided into separate strands for detail work. I wove pieces throughout the stone to give the illusion of vines. However, during that process, I accidentally separated the stones. No worries, I sprayed foam in the middle to secure the structure. Once the foam cured, I resumed scaping. A few were glued to the rocks for proper placement using the technique from earlier. I ended up with this as my hardscape. I think it turned out really well and has a lot of great texture. For the false bottom, I added a super thin layer of sand. The setup won't have much water in it, so I was able to keep this layer thin. I also added a layer of crushed charcoal. This will help keep the terrarium clean. I topped that off with the Fluval Stratum substrate from earlier. Normally I'd use my ABG mix for something like this, but the layers are so thin that compaction won't be an issue. Next I put damp sphagnum moss in crevices throughout the hardscape. These will help wick and retain moisture for the plants. For this portion of the build I'll use flame moss. I chopped it up into smaller pieces to spread the materials further. This moss of course was placed all over the patches of sphagnum moss. Right now it all looks pretty flat. Long term it will grow out into beautiful little tufts of moss. Periodically during this process I had to spray the moss to keep it from drying out. Next I put a thin layer of damp sphagnum moss on top of the substrate. This terrarium will feature a carpet of moss, and like the areas on the hardscape, this will help keep things hydrated. For the carpet I'll use Java moss. Like before, I chopped it up into smaller pieces and added a beautiful carpet atop the sphagnum moss. Again, everything was sprayed down. The other plants I'll use in this terrarium include Anubias nana Petite, Ficus puma crucifolia, Bulbitis deformis mini, dwarf mondo grass, and Selaginella kraussiana gold tips. I started by wedging Anubias between branches and crevices in the rocks. Even just these plants really helped add some great texture and color to the setup. Next were the ficus. I planted these between the dragon roots to give the illusion they are part of the vine structure created by the roots. I think they complement the hardscape very well. After that I planted the Bulbitis atop the entire structure. The mondo grass was then planted throughout the bottom of the setup. I think these add a neat tropical vibe to the aesthetic. Lastly, I added even more texture and color with the Selaginella. With everything planted, I gave the setup a good spray. I also taped off the glass dome to paint the outside of the base. I did that with black acrylic paint, let everything dry, and then removed the tape. What about stocking? As with any terrarium, I added Springtails to help keep the environment clean. Our main inhabitants are some garden millipedes. I used these as part of the cleanup crew in one of my vivariums. I was only able to find 4, but that should be enough to get a colony started. I'll add more as needed. There you have it, the Millipede Mountain Terrarium. It's something very different than what you've seen on the channel thus far, and I think it turned out great. I really like the texture and colors the dragonstone brings to the design. The cool thing was that I didn't have to manipulate the stones at all. I was able to find ones that fit together perfectly like a puzzle. I also think the plants contrast well with the stones and really pop out. I tried to keep my selection as small as possible to help retain a sense of scale. Could I have went smaller? Yes, but these are the plants I had to work with at the time. The millipedes of course add interest and movement to this setup. I will have to occasionally feed them to keep them happy. They seem to really like crested gecko diet, so that's what I'll use. Otherwise they may resort to eating the plants. I typically don't have issues with that though. Like any closed terrarium, it doesn't require watering. The ambient humidity should be enough to keep things hydrated. However, since I have to open it to feed the millipedes, I will water it at that time to compensate for lost humidity. Overall, I think it's just a really interesting design to look at. I can't wait to see this one grown in and what the future holds for it. I'm curious to know what you thought about it down in the comments. Let me know. As always, I hope you enjoyed this one and learned something new. If you did, let me know with a like. It helps out immensely. Until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.